joined by Vice Mayor Kate Gallego, Councilman Bill Gates, and Councilwoman Laura Pastor. I'm going to call the meeting to order. First item of the minutes of April 12th. Do I have any discussion, corrections, or motion?
I move minutes from April 12, 2016.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Next, we have consent agenda. Any questions, comments? Oh, I'm sorry, Marvin, I believe you had wanted to speak on item 2?
Yes, ma'am. Okay. The reason I want to talk about it, I know it's going over it more than once, but it's still in the best interest of Maryvale Town Council and the people living in Maryvale to find a way to get the light rail service that we were promised to have in 2016, and now they're saying 2030. So I implore all of you to put your heads together and try to get us the light rail that we need out in the West Valley. I've talked to many people about it, including Maria Hyatt, and I understand more than I understood before, but still, we need to have the light rail in West Valley. It needs to go out to the hospital on 91st and Thomas. It's now a 440-bed hospital, so it's a major hospital. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe that's the only card. Any conversation or a motion on the consent item?
I move.
Move approval. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all for information only. Does anyone need a briefing on any of them or have any questions? They're on here to give us an update on what other committees and other agencies are doing so that we have some inkling of there's coordination and what they're planning on doing.
Smart.
So I don't see anything that really stands out, so if I don't hear anything further, we will go to number 7. This is the transit, street furniture, and bus advertising revenue contracts.
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, Maria Hyatt is here with Ken Kessler and Wendy Miller from Public Transit to give you a presentation.
Good morning, Chairwoman Williams, members of the committee. We are here to talk about the combination of our street furniture as well as our bus advertising contracts, as well as the ability to bid separately on them. So we lined up these contracts 5 years ago with a thought that by combining the two contracts into one, we might have an opportunity to have a better economy of scales for the program and receive more revenue as a result. However, we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So we're going to go through the options that we're proposing as part of this invitation for bids, and Ken Kessler will talk further.
Thanks, Maria. Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, as Marie mentioned, I'm going to talk about our transit advertising programs. The two programs we have are transit furniture and bus advertising. These two programs together generate about $3.5 million annually for public transit for the city of Phoenix. So I just want to give a little bit of background on each of the different programs. First, the bus advertising program. Currently, the city has a fleet of about 480 buses that are capable of displaying advertising on the exterior as well as the interior of those vehicles. The current contractor is Clear Channel Outdoor, and the contract we currently have in place for that runs through September 30th of this year. That's why we're here to move forward with the request to issue the IFB to procure new contracts for these services. This contract has been a 10-year contract. It started back in October of 2006, and it's been a pretty lucrative contract for us. This one alone generates revenue annually about $1.5 million. And the types of ads range from cards within the bus up on the interior, what we call car cards displayed on the interior of the bus, as well as advertising on the back of the bus, what we call tail ads, to small side ads, as well as full sides and then full wraps of the whole bus. So those are the various types of advertising displayed on the buses. And then next we have our transit furniture advertising program. For this program, there's currently about 1,100 shelters, benches, and standalone kiosks in our system that are capable of displaying advertising for the public transit system. Currently, the contract for this service is with Outfront Media, and this contract began back in 2012. And again, like the bus advertising contract, it expires on September 30th of this year. As Maria indicated, we lined up the contracts to give the ability to potentially procure one contract and give the option for two contracts if that's more favorable for the city. And I'll get into that in just a moment. So now talking a little bit about the financials, as I mentioned, some of the revenue information. I guess I was remiss in talking about the furniture advertising generates about $2 million annually right now. As I mentioned, about 3.5 in total, 1.5 for the bus, and about $2 million from the furniture contract. So just historically, the minimum annual guaranteed revenue, both contracts have this stipulation in there. We're guaranteed a minimum amount. It began as $2 million for the bus advertising program, but with the decrease in our fleet size, we realized several years back as part of the budget cuts due to the recession, our fleet size went down. We have different buses with a little different configuration on those buses as far as where there's available ad space. So that's why currently the minimum annual guarantee is about $1.7 million. And right now, the actual sales revenue are not exceeding the minimum annual guarantee, so the 1.7 minimum is what we're receiving under that contract. And then for the transit furniture contract, the MAG started out as $1 million, and that was 10 years ago. That has grown over the years to just under $1.7 million, but actual sales for the furniture program exceed the minimum guarantee, and right now we're realizing about a little over $2 million a year in actual revenues from that particular program.
So let me just clarify that. So when our contractors make more than the minimum annual guarantee, that's when we get into the net sales revenue percentage. So we receive 63% on all sales above the minimum annual guarantee, correct?
Correct, yes.
So those two numbers are really important to us in order to maximize our revenue opportunities.
Yeah, so we have the minimum in there to guarantee us a certain amount of revenue, and then also the percentages that you see up there, there's just slightly different between the two current contracts. And we'll get into that in another couple slides here as far as how this IFB is going to work for bidders to bid on those percentages for the new contracts. So before we go there, just to give you a little history on the revenues under these two programs, you can see there in the greenish color there, that's our furniture program. It's been growing about $100,000 a year over the last 4 years in revenues, and again, that's because that program is actually exceeding the minimum annual guarantee. And then with the bus program, it's been kind of bouncing around $1 million in actual sales revenue, but again, we have the minimum annual guarantee, which we've been getting, which has been a little bit more than the actual percentage based on the sales. So in 2015, you see a bit of a spike there for bus, and that was primarily due to Super Bowl advertising that occurred in 2015 on the buses. So now, as we look forward to the new contracts, which is why we're here, to look at a procurement to, as we talked about, put out an invitation for bid to give an option for bidders to either bid on a single contract for the combined bus and furniture, or to bid separately for the furniture and the bus. So we're providing those options in the IFB pricing sheet, and I'll get to an example in just a moment here that shows exactly how that works and how that will be evaluated. And we're hopeful, as Maria had kind of alluded to, that this will allow us to maximize our potential revenue, whether it ends up being two separate contracts again, or possibly one contract that maybe there might be some economies of scale where advertisers can go through one contractor to advertise both on furniture as well as bus. But we recognize that there are some differences in the types of advertisers that prefer bus versus the, the location of a specific shelters out there. So now here's an example of how the bidding process would work under this IFB. So in this hypothetical example here, what we laid out is one bidder, Company A, who decided to bid only on furniture and not on bus, and obviously not combined as well. And then the other two hypothetical bidders, Company B and C, bidding on both the bus, the furniture, and a combined bid percentage. And so just to clarify, in the bidding pricing sheet in this IFB, basically the bidders will be just providing a percentage for each. So if they want to bid on all three, basically it's the table with the green heading at the top, what they'll provide us those numbers. And we'll apply those against the estimated current revenues under both of the programs. So right now, Transit Furniture adds sales revenue. This is the amount of sales that the actual contractor is realizing through the sales of ads, is about $3.2 million. And for bus, it's about 2.5. So we'll ask bidders to bid their percentage for each of those areas, and then apply those percentages to those dollars, and then select the scenario that gives us the best financial benefit, whether that be, as in this example, 2 different companies for each of the contracts, or it could be one company that bids a higher percentage that yields a higher dollar amount under a combined percentage for both the furniture and the bus. And I guess I'll pause here before I go on, because there's a lot of numbers, a lot of information here in case there's any questions. So.
So our intent here is this is included in the invitation for bids, so any bidder is fully aware of how they will be evaluated against any of the other bidders, any other proposers, so that they can get a better feel for it. We just wanted it to be very transparent.
What's the difference between an IFP and an RFP?
IFB, Madam Chair, is basically the price or dollar amount is the sole factor in making the recommendation for award. In RFP, you have other qualifications like experience of the firm or experience of personnel and things like that go into play in terms of the evaluation.
So on IFP, you don't care about experience. Is that what you're saying?
Right, in IFB, we're looking at maximizing the revenue, and I guess directly, yes, Madam Chair, but maybe indirectly, based on the numbers that they bid, would tell us whether or not they feel as a company that they could generate, a level of revenues that we're seeking. And just to clarify, we do, one thing I'm remiss in mentioning, we did put a minimum annual guarantee required in the bid, so there is a minimum guarantee required in the bid. So if there's bidders out there, maybe companies that aren't quite as experienced and they don't think they can meet that, they probably won't bid, because otherwise they may be paying us a lot more than they may be taking in if they don't have experience in generating the ad revenue.
I guess it just makes me nervous to think that this would be an opportunity for someone who has no experience to jump in and think they're really going to do this, and it's more complicated than it sounds. I don't think it's like just putting something on the side of a bus. Did you have a question,
Yes,
Councilman?
thank you, Madam Chair. So the last time we bid this out, did we do an IFB or did we do an RFP?
I believe on the furniture we did an RFP, and on the bus we did an IFB.
Okay. And at the airport, when we did the airport advertising the last time, what did we do there? Do you recall? Was that IFB or an RFP?
I do not know, but I'll find out.
I believe it's an RFP.
Okay.
Councilman Gates, Madam Chair.
And also wanted to mention, Wendy had mentioned to me that actually in the IFB document itself as well, we did put a minimum of 5 years experience required for any bidders.
So let me clarify. There's 5 years experience required, or they're not responsive. Plus, there's the minimum annual guarantee. And the minimum annual guarantee is a requirement that they have to pay. If they cannot pay that, then they would be in default of the contract. So between those two, the thought here is that you're only getting companies who are experienced and are able, feel very comfortable that they're going to meet that minimum annual guarantee as well as exceed that minimum annual guarantee, because that's where they make their profit.
And Madam Chair, if I could clarify as well, so the minimum annual guarantees that we set up in the IFB are at the current levels of revenue that we're receiving. So it's 1.5 million on the bus side and 2 million on the transit furniture side. So we'd be expecting bidders that are confident that they can meet the sales levels that we're achieving today. Otherwise, as Maria had indicated, they potentially be getting into this losing money.
And to
And the
further
next-
clarify, I'm sorry, Madam Chair,
pardon, go ahead.
we also have an expectation that they would be providing their financials as well for review.
An expectation is not written.
It's a
as-
requirement
A requirement.
in the IFB, yes.
In the near future, we're going to be adding many bus benches. Is that not correct?
Madam Chair, that is correct. We will be adding, as part of Transportation 2050, we committed to providing shade at all of our bus stops. And so we will be evaluating which of those sites would make sense to have advertising shelters included as part of, an advertising component included as part of a shelter as we go and expand in the future.
Do you have a plan on how many per year?
For new advertising shelters or new shelters?
Well, I would think they'd be both, wouldn't they?
Not necessarily. So
Why?
currently, we're not selling all of our ad shelters. So not all, we do not have ads at all of our ad shelters today. So you want to be very strategic on where you make that investment on the location for those shelters versus having just a blank, advertise here sign. So we will be working with our contractor on what locations would make sense with the demographics as well as the sales opportunities to put those in.
Councilwoman?
What's the thought process between, of determining an IFP versus an RFP? What was the thought behind it? Was it because of generating revenue or?
Yeah, so Madam Chair, Councilwoman Pastor, yeah, the basic thought process in an IFB versus an RFP for this was to maximize revenue as the sort of the focus of this type of contract.
And to maximize the revenue, so how in an RFP will we not maximize our revenue?
Well, Madam Chair, Councilman Pastor, in an RFP, there's typically 3, 4, 5 different criteria that are evaluated. And while price is usually the most heavily weighted, you could possibly have somebody who comes out on top on other criteria that maybe doesn't have the best price, or in this case, the best revenue. Maybe they're, much more experienced in things like that, but maybe they're not proposing as much revenue. So that would be a scenario where you could possibly have a more experienced firm or a firm that necessarily doesn't come up with the most revenue for the city.
So wouldn't that be determined on how the RFP is written and how the rubric is written and where you would look at that? I'm just asking because is this okay, so let me back up. In doing this IFP, we have experience in doing this IFP with this particular contract?
Yes, Madam Chair, Councilwoman Pastor, we did IFB with the last bus contract that, shelter contract that went into place in January of 2012.
Yeah.
So, Madam Chair, Councilwoman Pastor, typically, when we have a set number of, we have a quantity that's defined, we have an experience level that's defined. The focus really then is on the maximizing the revenue. So you typically would not find a company who is not experienced in this and can meet the minimum annual guarantee, wouldn't take that kind of risk to bid on a contract that they're required then to provide, 2 million plus. So that was the primary factor on why we issued an IFB instead of an RFP, because the other factors are not there. So you know how many shelters, you know what the minimum annual guarantee is. the extra features that a request for proposal typically has are not there. So a request for proposal would be, tell us how many shelters, tell us the locations of them, tell us whether you would add new features to those. That's the type of bid process where, because you're asking for their input on design or qualities for that, a request for proposal makes sense. But when you have a defined number of shelters, you're really then looking at maximizing your revenue versus the other extras. And I'm not sure that I said that very well, but this one is very defined with the number of shelters. The quantity is not going to change significantly other than those new shelters we add. The materials are exactly the same at each one of them, and it's a matter of gaining the price to maximize the revenues. Boy, I just dug a hole in I did not
So
explain
what
that well.
I'm sorry, Madam
No,
Chair.
go ahead.
So what I am hearing in all of that is that there's a narrowing of the field with the IFP. And what I mean by that is you have to have experience of 5 years. You have to have, can you generate this revenue for this many shelters? If not, then you will default in the contract. Those are the details that probably we haven't seen, and where we're probably struggling with to understand the difference between an RFP and an RFP, due to the fact that we're probably more commonly aware of RFPs. So I understand, and it's also maximizing your revenue. I'm not really sure if, I get it and I understand, but I'm sure you could probably do it in an RFP. It's just all in the way it's written and how it's written.
Now it's weighted.
Yeah, exactly. So I understand, I guess. It's just IFP is new to me.
Council, or Vice Mayor?
This contract will cover all of our buses, but not paratransit. Will it, is that right? And then rapid circulators. So tell us what's included in this.
So, Madam Chair, Vice Mayor Gallego, currently we advertise on all of our local fixed route buses and our rapid buses. We don't advertise on paratransit vehicles, and we don't advertise on the neighborhood circulators.
And that's because there's not enough ridership so that there's no market demand?
That's basically it, correct, yes.
And it's sometimes been a source of, I will get complaints from constituents, like, you don't advertise in Ahwatukee, but you do on my bus. Why? It's really market.
Correct, yes. It's where the revenues will be generated on the vehicles. And there are, some advertising shelters in the Ahwatukee area, just not the vehicles that operate out there, since we don't operate any of the local fixed route buses out there, just the Alex circulator.
And how do we know that there's no market demand? Our private sector partner has told us, or?
Madam Chair, Vice Mayor Gallego, yes, basically through the years of working with our various advertising contractors, they're in the advertising business, they're the experts, and they know sort of the market and where the demands are, because they're in it to maximize their revenue as well. And so we work with them to basically determine what works best as far as, whether it be vehicles or locations when we're talking transit furniture and so forth.
And is it primarily driven just by eyeballs? Or is it, because if Ahwatukee can support a newspaper, you would think it could also support advertising on circulators. Well, I would think that, you would probably.
Yes, and Madam Chair, Vice Mayor Gallego, I think in terms of looking at, we haven't advertised on the neighborhood circulars. A lot of that too is the ad space size for the vehicles themselves are different than a fixed route bus, because there's certain, when you're talking bus advertising, there's certain expectation from advertisers as far as certain size. They have various sizes called queen and king and full side and full wraps and all these technical terms like that. And so a lot of it comes down to the actual space available on the vehicle types, just because of the bigger buses have the bigger spaces. They can have larger size ads, where the ads that would go on the smaller neighborhood circulator vehicles would not generate the demand for those types of small ads driving by in a vehicle.
Madam Chair, Councilwoman or Vice Mayor Gallego, However, we're open to this. This is, if there is a demand and there's a market for it, we do not have anything that precludes putting it on a circulator. We just have not seen the demand or the request for that from our vendor saying this is a great opportunity. But we are open to any of those revenue opportunities on the circulator or on the dial-a-ride for that matter, if that is an opportunity. As Ken indicated, we do not operate the bus service that serves Ahwatukee. That is our RPTA, the Valley Metro buses, and they do not advertise on their buses, which is another reason why you do not see advertising within the Ahwatukee area on the local fixed route bus service.
Great. And then you mentioned that we had a higher revenue during the Super Bowl. Did we have a one-time contract with the Super Bowl and its advertising partners? Or since we have another mega event coming up in March, help us understand if the Super Bowl was a one-time thing or?
Sure. Madam Chair, Vice Mayor Gallego, those contracts are all managed through the contractor for the buses. That was Clear Channel. And I'm not aware, maybe Wendy can help me with this because she's a little closer to the details of the contracts. But they manage those contracts. We review every single contract that comes through for whether it's buses or shelters to review for obviously content and making sure that the revenue in the contract is the revenue we're receiving, et cetera, et cetera. My guess is that Clear Channel did contract with some of those one-time, opportunities for Super Bowl, big events like that may happen again for the Final Four next year. And I don't know, Wendy, do you have anything further to add?
Yes, Madam Chair, Vice Mayor Gallego, the indication from the contractor was that they had several national campaigns that came through. They worked nationally and locally to advertise with businesses. So I think that, yes, they did take advantage of all of those opportunities. It isn't a one-time thing. If we have a big event, for the future, they will be reaching out and I'm sure bringing more advertisers to us.
College
So
Champ game didn't quite have the same splash then.
the size of it, no, but they're always working to increase their revenue because that's their bread and butter. And I'm sure that we'll see at least a little bit of an increase for future big events.
And I wanted to follow up on one of my colleagues' questions. As we expand the transit shelters, it sounds like because we're going primarily in areas with a little bit more outlying areas that we may not be adding advertising options as often?
Madam Chair, Vice Mayor Gallego, and I'll get that wrong for the next 6 months.
You can just, Councilwoman is fine.
We will be working on, obviously, our goal is to maximize our revenue. So we will be looking at every single one of those shade shelters and determining which one would make the most sense to add in advertising to that. And that's obviously our goal throughout this.
And to follow up on that, Madam Chair, Vice Mayor Gallego, I think the one thing we look at and that our contractors constantly advise us about is we don't want to oversaturate the market with ad space that, as Maria kind of mentioned earlier, has signs that basically say, place your ad here, because then it tells the advertising market that we don't have very much demand. We're oversupplied, so it's going to drive the price down per location. So we want to be cognizant of maintaining a good balance of what we supply versus what the demand is out there. And obviously, location is a big part of it, and that's where we rely on the advertising experts, the contractors that we hire to tell us where the demand is. And so if we need to add some in some of the newer places, that makes sense. Obviously, that's something we will do, and then look at possibly, and we've done it in the past where we look at locations that just have never sold and taking it out because we don't want to keep a kiosk there with a blank place your ad here type of thing, because again, it just sends a bad signal to the market.
I've got two quick questions. One, do you work with streets to get the traffic count? Is that part of the process?
Madam Chair, yes, the contractor does work with the Streets Department in obtaining that information to help determine as well as, but traffic trends are big for them to make that determination. And at any time, they can run a revenue report that says, these are our most popular locations. We'd like to, they could let us know it's a part of the contract currently, and also an opportunity in the new contract for them to let us know, we'd like to move a kiosk here that would be higher generating. And we believe, so if we have a set amount of shelters and there's one that's non-performing, they can actually request to have that moved to a higher performing to generate additional revenue.
What do you mean non-performing?
If the, like Ken had mentioned, place your ad here, you know, the advertiser is not selling it. We average probably right now on the transit shelter side, the last quarter was a vacancy or an occupancy rate of 65%. So there was a large amount of the shelters that weren't sold. So our goal is always to increase that, and that's part of our request for them is to figure out ways. But we don't want to have vacant space if at all possible. So by adding too many more ad shelters, you could oversaturate the market with not enough sales.
Is there a way, or do we use the vacant ones to promote city programs or services?
Absolutely, yes, Madam Chair, we do have that program now. We have the opportunity to promote city services, and we currently are working with our, through the PIOs to let them know that they can potentially even get some of their advertising funded. Because there is a revenue, or there is a expense for them to print out their ads, and the departments can get that paid for. Because the current contractors have to print out their own ads anyway, so they would also, they don't necessarily want to advertise that there's vacant space, so they're allowing the departments to get their services printed, their ads up, at no cost to the departments.
Because I don't recall seeing any of them.
That's a relatively new development that we're working on right now.
Did you have a question?
I have a question and a comment. Is it possible to continue this item to May, I think it's 24th, that we meet up again? I just feel like there's a lot of,
There's two parts to this. One is issuing and one's continuing the current contract. Is that not correct?
Yes,
Can we
Madam Chair.
divide that in
Yeah.
half and issuing the new one
sure,
to the next meeting and the current contract approved today so that
sure.
we can, I'm just throwing that out. We do have a card though before we make a decision and a motion.
Okay. And then one of my questions, on those expanded transit shelters, the ones that have non-advertisement or not considered high visibility, is it possible then to use those shelters to advertise our city programs, our city services, possibly our city, our numbers as to Crime Stop, all the different numbers that we have for emergencies, and get that information out in those areas? I'm just thinking of innovative ways of how we can use that space, and be able to provide something for those areas, or at least information. So that's just a thought.
Madam Chair, Councilwoman Pastor, the way the advertising guidelines were modified, we did allow, as Wendy mentioned, the opportunity for departments to put in ads specific to City of Phoenix programs. So when this item is continued to the 24th, we will include more information on that, and specifically to what you just requested, Councilwoman Pastor, in our next presentation.
And Madam Chair, just to follow up on that briefly, in particular, if we can provide space for those programs that generate revenue, like the golf program, that seems like that would really, we'd be getting a lot more bang for our buck, especially where we have these upgraded golf courses now. So maybe people, aren't aware of that, or, give them, pique their interest and get them out to these fabulous renovated golf courses that we have.
See, and I'm thinking, fight animal abuse.
It doesn't generate revenue, but that's a
No, I
great
know.
cause.
I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah.
thinking. Okay. Pardon me, go ahead.
One quick question. The 65% or the 65% occupancy rate, could you sort of put that in context? Is that what our peer transit agencies are doing? Do we know?
Not necessarily off the top of my head for the other areas. We have what we have for here, but we can provide that.
I just think it would be interesting to that is higher than I would have guessed in terms of vacancies, but maybe it's just, how much does, in a sort of, not near downtown, but outside of downtown, how much does it cost for a month to have a transit shelter?
It varies, but it
A low end,
can-
like one that might be vacant,
Right.
a low end.
It could be $300 a month,
Okay.
all the way up to, in the high end, some of them are selling for, $1,000 a month. It just depends on the location. But a vacant one that isn't selling very well, they could sell it for 300, 400, just depends.
Great, thank you.
Casey Sexton? Would you like to? Please.
Hi there. Thank you for letting me speak. My name is Casey Sexton. I'm with Lamar Transit Advertising. I'm the U.S. Territory Manager and Vice President. Our organization represents about 60 bus and street furniture contracts in the U.S. and Canada. And I can tell you personally, I've been taking personal interest in the city of Phoenix for the last 3 or 4 years because it's such a special city, and the system here is really tailor-made for transit advertising, both on the street furniture and the bus, as well as the light rail. And I know the light rail is not coming out to bid currently. One of the things with Prop 104 that's really intriguing is the expansion of the services and be able to partner with the city and expand those services. Dovetailed with that, technology is really becoming integrated into the transit system across the United States with Wi-Fi sponsorships, beacon technology, wayfinding signs, digital platforms. So there's a myriad of things that are coming down the pike. You see it mostly on the East Coast right now, but you can see the writings on the wall, and we want to partner with the city and with the appetite for tech and education here. It would be a wonderful partnership from my humble point of view. But I really just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity. I know there's discussion about IFB or RFP. You can rest assured whichever direction council goes or transit goes, we'll be happy participant. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? So when you mentioned electronic signs, I certainly enjoy when I travel to other cities and it's very clear the bus that I want is coming in 3 minutes and it's going where I hope to go.
Yeah.
Should we think about that as we do this?
There's lots of platforms out there. Several platforms out there. There's companies that are currently doing that sort of technology. NextBus is a company that comes to mind that transmit information to your smartphone that can say bus 1207 is coming down in the next 3 minutes. And so I think where I see the future and the opportunity is that will be an opportunity for amenity for passengers, because as we know with Uber and Lyft taking some of those riderships, we want to develop amenities that are going to keep riders on the bus, as well as we want to be in high profile dense areas where a lot of people see the bus. So to your opinion, we want to make it as efficient and amenable to travel on the bus as possible. And I think technology is here to stay and is coming quickly.
And should we think about electronic signs as we issue this? I hadn't been, and now I am.
Yeah, sure. I think depending on the platform. So if it's on the light rail, we see that, a digital sign that's combined with a wayfinding sign rather. And so I think you can monetize that. I think you could monetize Wi-Fi. Digital signs on the bus, what we found is we've done some pilot programs in different cities. It's not quite there yet because it's cost prohibitive. But on the bus, not quite yet, but on the platforms and different key locations, absolutely, it's already here in a lot of major cities.
I think in some of the outlying areas of our city, probably people wouldn't be excited about digital, but maybe in our downtown
Yeah.
entertainment district,
Yeah.
where we have the most people,
Right.
it does make sense. Should we think?
Well, there's different opportunities. There's kiosk opportunities where you could have services in, like San Francisco, they have the kiosks where they have the bathrooms. I don't know if you all want to go there, but you can wrap those different types of kiosks, those different type of assets with almost anything, or you can hardwire them and develop a digital message. So there is. And again, what we try to do is embark on a partnership with whoever we're in business with so that we can explore the opportunities together.
I'm just thinking maybe there's opportunities to provide real-time information to folks that improves ridership and revenue.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Howard May?
Good morning, subcommittee and members of Transit and Madam Chair. Recently, I took a trip to Desert Sky, as Maria already knows, and you guys have new digital signs there. I like them. I did make a comment about those prior to this with a card or something, suggestion or by email or whatever. I like that the sign at Desert Sky. It's really cool and it makes my life easier. However, font could be just a little bit bigger. But I think that particular sign that like you have at Desert Sky, you can have them at other transit centers. Makes my life easier. I don't have to call Next Ride. I can just, okay. So like Central Station, you should put one in. Montebello should have one. I mean, different, Ed Pasteur, all your transit centers where you have more than 3 buses or even 2 buses, that would be really cool. When you put those in, you should think of which way are they facing to the customers, because the one at Desert Sky doesn't really help me because it's facing the car lot. I spoke to somebody on transit on the phone or by email and said that it needs to be facing as you're getting off the bus. And but you guys are talking about bus stops, and I'm always talking to transit on ways to improve bus stops to where wheelchairs don't go falling off the back of them. One of the stops I had them change was 19th Avenue, Indian School, westbound 41, 1950 West. Some of the current bus stops or stops you're going to put in for benches, you should think about putting dividers on the seats like you did at Dunlap Station to prevent people from camping out. And from time to time, I reported this in the past, you have certain bus stops that go dark because either the lights went out or somebody messed with the station, the stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions, comments? Any other information for us? Okay, can I have a motion?
I'd like to make a motion to continue this item with the exception of the current contract terms with the Outdoor Media and Clear Channel to December 31st, 2016.
December? Oh,
Through December,
mind.
through
Yeah.
December,
okay.
through December.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And then the rest, we will continue to our next meeting and have you come back, and we'll try this again. Thank you. We will go to number 8, customer care and billing system upgrade.
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, from the Water Department and from Public Works, we have John Trujillo, Catherine Sorensen, our Water Director, and Debbie Cotton is here, Chief Information Officer, along with Alicia Solano to present on this item.
Welcome.
Councilwoman Subcommittee, thank you for having us. It's been a while since we gave you an update on the CC&B upgrade, so we thought it was just time. Want to just give you an update on where we are, bring a couple of issues to your attention. Alicia Solano is going to take us through most of this conversation. She's the Assistant Director in Water Services who is overseeing this effort in partnership with ITD and Public Works and the Finance Department. The rest of us will just kind of join in from time to time as well.
Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and start with the background and history. So as you're aware, we service approximately 430,000 accounts that generate approximately 5 million bills per year to collect for water, wastewater, and solid waste services, as well as taxes and fees. Through that, we gain approximately $750 million annually in revenues. To give you the history, we are currently on version 2.1, which was implemented back in 2010 and received approval from this committee as well as council to move forward with the integration and upgrade of 2.4. The goals of this upgrade are to enhance the customer self-service, as well as to minimize the number of customizations and gain efficiencies. So in 2.1, there were a lot of customizations. So we're really focusing on changing our business practice to streamline it and make it more customer service and to minimize those customizations. As a reminder, this was the CCNB proposed timeline that was presented back in 2014. You can see that we've already gone through the scope of work. We completed the fit gap analysis in December of 2015. We're going to go through some of those with you in a little bit. We're currently in design configuration and testing. System testing has begun in May as well. So we just started on that with training to start later this summer. And the goal is to have 2.4 roll out in spring of 2017. So fit gap, we brought in a consultant, Ernst & Young, who's the contractor, to walk us through what's going to match seamlessly with little effort or connect into our systems, as well as defining risks. So with all large projects, inherently there's risks associated with that. So they've helped us define both the fits, what's going to work really, really well, and where we need to put a little more attention. So some of the fits that you see are going to be efficiencies found as far as automating letters, reducing customization, and reducing manual processes, as well as upgrading our web portal, which we're super excited about. Some of the gaps and risks are going to be bill print, additional integration needing, and some staffing.
Go back to that on customization. Could you explain that? What's
So-
that mean?
Let me jump in and try my best here, Councilwoman. So apparently when we first implemented the CCNB software back in 2010, instead of taking the time to go back and really examine our business processes, we tried to customize the software to fit how we were doing things at that time. And as a result, we had to customize the software to a very significant degree. So what we're trying to do this time instead is to take a look at what the software offers just out of the box and see if we can't change our business processes, streamline them, find those efficiencies and just use the system as it comes. There's a lot of advantages in doing that, and Debbie can speak more to this than I can. But so, for example, because we had customized the old software to such a degree, it was very difficult for us to go in and do patches and to fix things, because it kind of just becomes a monster that is very difficult to maintain. So we're really focused on changing the way we do business and matching the software and only using customizations where we absolutely have to. And particularly, we're emphasizing the use of customizations for customer service to make sure that the web is very customer friendly, those types of enhancements, instead of forcing it to do things the way that we used to do things.
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, I would agree. It really is a best practice. With the implementation of modern technology systems, these vendors have implementations around the country. So Oracle is using this platform in many cities. They have experience in doing utilities. It really does not make sense for us to continue to just operate business as usual. It is to our best advantage to take advantage of what the vendor is bringing forth from the marketplace. It really is the best way to go. It will give us streamline business processes, customer service enhancements, and also ensure that we have the ability to upgrade our systems. We know that with modern technology systems, vendors are always coming out with fixes to improve performance of the system. We also know that in the cyberspace, the hackers are out there finding a way to exploit the systems. So if we are as vanilla as possible, we'll be able to implement all of those changes that the vendor will provide for us. It will make it much easier and allow our systems to be up to date.
And if I could, Councilwoman Subcommittee, if I could just break in real quickly before we go into the gaps. And Alicia's going to take us through some of the gaps. So these are some of the issues and risks that we have found as we went through the analysis to date. This is an extremely complicated undertaking. It's a very large system, very complicated system. It's major software to implement and upgrade. And as a result, we do have some additional management oversight, understanding the importance of this. for our customers and for our financial stability. So we'll, as we go through the gaps, we'll also talk a little bit about some of the findings of that management oversight report.
Councilman Gates?
I'm okay. Actually, I had questions about the gaps, but
Oh.
I'll wait to hear the presentation.
I have a question. Can you give me an example of a customization? Like, what would you be, what exactly?
I can give you an example. So for billing, we had so many customizations in the bill print to have charts or to manipulate the data so that we have units on there. So those are customizations that we had to write for bill print that we're looking to actually have been able to eliminate through this process.
So, okay, so, and I'm gonna use two different. We have the city bill, the water bill that has those charts, and then I get my electric bill, and it tells me how my efficiency is, how I'm, my neighbors and everything else. So are you saying that little piece will be eliminated, how much water I use, or? No,
So,
okay.
Councilwoman Pastor, so
It's in the back end then?
it's in the back
Okay,
end, and
all right,
and we're
got it.
still,
I just got it.
but I want to be clear, one of the things that we did do is, in the previous implementation back in 2010, we did spend a very large amount of time and energy making the bill look a very particular
Okay.
way. We would like to avoid that to the extent that we can, while still understanding that there are certain things that we're going to want to show our customers, like consumption patterns. But we're really trying to focus on how does this thing come out of the box? Because the customization of the bill print that we did back in 2010 has turned out to be very problematic for us over time. So for example, when certain categories change, when certain city taxes change, it has been very difficult and very time-consuming for us to go back and implement those changes because the system was just so customized. So moving forward, we'd like to take a look at how does this come out of the box, vanilla, what does it look like? And we also want to really focus our customers on the web and on self-service. And so we're hoping that through those customizations, we can get to the same place, make sure that we're still showing consumption patterns and other things that we know are important, but really leverage just what the software has to offer.
I think another way of saying it is that we are really more focused on the content of the bill and allowing the vendor to provide what they're already providing, because providing consumption patterns and information as that is really normal in the industry. Any utility person would want to have that. Therefore, any vendor is going to provide that solution. What we are less focused on is the look. So the bill may look differently from an appearance perspective. However, you will still have largely the same amount of information. It just may be in a different location.
It's not gonna look pretty. No, just joking, I'm teasing.
It'll be gorgeous.
I'm teasing. So what I'm hearing is maintenance and cost on the back end when we customize. And as we customize, more and more we customize, it's more maintenance and it's more cost and expertise that is needed to understand the customization.
Yep.
Okay, got it.
Got it.
And an inability to remain current
Okay.
with technology as
To
well.
modernize, yeah.
Yes.
Got it.
So before we get and talk about more of the risks, we're going to talk about some of the things that we found that were positives, some of the fits. So online bill presentation. So as Catherine mentioned, we are very excited about the online bill presentation. It's mobile friendly, it's very flexible, it's changeable to the customer. You're able to go back and print more than just the current month. You'll be able to go back and get 12, 24 months worth of bills. And there were absolutely no customizations on this bill moving forward. So again, that will impact the look of the bill moving forward. Customer enhancements. Customers can pick how they receive notification, if they want a text message so many days before the bill's due, if they want an email. So they can talk about how they prefer to receive notification. Another big fit for us is the training repository. So we're super excited about this, and we'll be talking a little bit more about this in a future slide, that we're going to be able to train all of our customer service and public works staff online, and it'll be a repository, so it's consistent training that will be held, and they'll be taking tests to make sure that they understand the system. It's one message, sent the same way, to provide consistency to our staff, so we're very excited about that. And we're also, another big update we're super excited about is master updates for multiple accounts. So if you think about, say, Circle K, their corporate headquarters produces one check for 250 accounts that we might have in the city. Right now, we have to go in and manually touch all 250 accounts to take the one check they receive, which of course brings additional risk in. Through the new system, we'll be able to manage large accounts like that. So definite staff savings, and it's a benefit to the customer as well. Self-service and public interface, the web portal. Again, a lot of focus is going to be placed on the web portal for the customer experience. We get a lot of feedback from our customers right now on the current web, and they're asking for updates and upgrades. So we're super excited that we're going to be able to provide that in this new rollout. They'll be able to do things like turn on and turn off and transfer services right online. They'll be able to access their information online at 24 hours, 7 days a week. They can view their water consumption, they can view their past payments, they can sign up for auto pay, and so it's going to be a great enhancement to the customers. So those are some of the positives we found going through the Fit Gap analysis. We're going to start talking about some of the risks and some of the gaps that were found when going through the Fit Gap analysis as well. So the first one that we're going to talk about is bill print. So we had a couple options here. We could spend the money and upgrade with our current vendor to make sure it's supported and talked to the new system. And so when we were starting that process, we started asking, well, let's take a look at industry standard. What is the best practice out there? And by doing that, we found that, industry standard really is that we outsource bill print, that we really shouldn't necessarily be in the business of printing our bills. So we took that forward and we brought it to the sponsors and to the executive team, and we decided we're going to go ahead and outsource the bill print. It's outside of the scope for CCMB, so this was an additional project that Public Works and Water Services are taking on. So the RFP was released on April 22nd. The pre-proposal was held on the 4th. Proposals are due on the 20th, and we're hoping to hit the June 22nd formal council meeting. And we'll need to make sure that that's in process and in place no later than September 1st in order to meet the deadlines and the next big steps moving forward. The risk here is if for some reason we can't meet that deadline, there could possibly be a delay, or we'll have to pursue another option moving forward.
Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair. So what's our current percentage of customers who are not receiving a printed bill?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gates, I can answer that for you. We have 12% of our customer base right now is currently on e-bill, and we are constantly striving to increase that number. So we would really like to see it closer to 15 or 20%. Our goal for this fiscal year was actually to get to 10% by the end of the fiscal year. Happy to report that our Deputy Director over in Customer Service and Water, Michelle, has done a great job, and we actually hit that goal early. We hit it at the end of December. We're currently at 12%, and we're constantly trying to engage our customers to see if they would like to go through the e-bill.
What type of incentives do we provide to encourage that?
Madam Chair, Subcommittee, we actually offer Jeans Day. If you succeed in your goals, you get to wear jeans on Friday. Oh, but do you mean
That's
customer?
awesome.
Sorry, they can wear jeans too.
For some people,
every day.
for some people, that's dressing up. So
Right.
you know.
Well, that's true. That's true. Currently, we do not offer a financial incentive, but we just try to explain to customers that it makes it easier for them. They can have online access to their bill at any time, and so far we're making really good progress with that.
Okay. Well, is there a reason that we don't provide a financial incentive?
Councilmember Gates, we wanted to see if there was some low-hanging fruit that we could pick first. But I know other utilities do offer incentives, and that's certainly something that we can look to in the future. But we wanted to make sure that we were first picking whatever low-hanging fruit we could before moving to a financial incentive. Yeah.
Thank you.
Another risk and gap identified was system integration.
Yes, and I'll talk a little bit about that, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee. As Catherine mentioned earlier, this is a huge system that we are upgrading. And with any system you upgrade, these systems aren't standalone. There's other systems that are integrated into this system. A good example is our mobile workforce management, our business intelligence system, our ePay. There's other systems that touches this system. And so as part of the gap we are looking at is, and we don't know until we get to that point, there are some of those systems that are integrated within our current CC&B system. There could be some issues. And we're going through that process now and identifying what issues could occur when we actually integrate after we upgrade CC&B system. And some of these systems that are integrated with CC&B might have to be upgraded, which could in turn cause a delay into the project and moving forward. So we're going through that process now and identifying what potential issues could occur. And right now, we're just looking at that at this time. And so there's several of them we're looking at, and hopefully the current systems that are integrated with CC&B won't be an issue, and we just have to make sure that they connect and we can continue to talk with the system.
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, one of the other items that we're working on is staffing. And with any project of this type, we have existing staff that are working on the CC&B system today. In order for them, on the current CC&B 2.1, we need for those staff to become a part of the 2.4 project team so that they may be engaged in implementing the new system and learning the new technology. However, we still have a 2.1 environment that must be maintained because that is the system that customers are using today. So in order to accomplish both of these tasks, we must have backfill. We can't expect staff to do more, well, they're already doing two things, but let's not add a third one. So we're going to add some backfill staff in order to be able to assist them in maintaining the day-to-day. We have identified 9 positions total that we will need to backfill. We are moving forward on the May 18th formal agenda to get your approval for that staff augmentation contract. We do want to note that the funding for this is already included in the budget. So we're not asking for additional money. We're just asking for your approval to be able to execute that contract with a third party. The other reason why this is really helpful is that some of these contractors are going to provide some expertise that we don't have today. As we said earlier, the last time we did this was 2010. And so we really could use some expertise from people in the private sector who are doing this today, who have expertise with the most recent version of CC&B. The other item that we know where we will also need help is because we are using a new system, we may need additional staff once the project is implemented. We're evaluating options on that right now. We want to be sure that we're using the resources effectively, and we will come back to you again at a later time should those resources be needed. However, once again, it is no additional money. All the money is included in the existing budget. We would just need your authority and approval to execute another contract at that time.
If I could add, Councilwoman Williams as well, to Debbie's point, this staffing and finding the right technical staff is an issue and a risk that was identified in the management oversight report, which is kind of like welcome to Debbie's world. It is sometimes very difficult to identify and find the correct technical resources for these types of specialized projects.
And that is a very good point. One of the things we're seeing in technology is that many of my staff are actually being hired away by the private sector, where they're actually sometimes doubling and tripling their money when they leave here. So it is a constant challenge, but we also know that it is a flow. We've seen this before. In my career, this is not the first time, it's not the second time. When the private sector heats up, they go, they make lots and lots of money, and then when the private sector cuts, they come back. So it's just the way it is. We're an employer, but it just takes more time. We are able to find top talent, but it just takes us just a little bit longer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, is there another side, though, to staffing? Because presumably, if we have a better web portal, we have more user-friendly interfaces, then that means we're going to become more automated. So, do you anticipate we're going to need fewer people in the call centers moving forward?
So, Councilwoman Williams, Councilmember Gates, that is certainly our hope and our goal moving forward, and we're relatively confident that we can get there. Certainly as we push more customers towards e-bill, as we have more customer self-service, we believe that we can achieve that over time. But I do want to say, in terms of technical staff and the staff that Debbie needs to help support this system, I would expect that we would need at least as many people as we have today, and probably more. And this is a conversation that Debbie and John and I have had several times, looking to the future to make sure that we are really supporting this software and the hardware appropriately. Right now, we do have some vulnerabilities. We have some key areas where there's just maybe one technical person who understands this. So we're really looking to fill some of those voids and make sure that we have the right technical staff moving forward. But as far as the call center goes, absolutely. And it won't just be the technological improvements. I really want to brag about Michelle Joyner for a moment. She runs the utility billing center, and she's just done a phenomenal job over the last year, not only in finding technical improvements, but also just in terms of finding business process improvements and staff efficiencies. So for example, we were really having some problems, I'm sure you guys remember these days, with extended wait times in the call center. She's really turned that around to where, the last time I looked at the statistics, 98% of our calls were being answered within 2 minutes. That's an unbelievable improvement compared to where we were a year ago. Part of the way that she got there was we realized that we had kind of a back office problem where we were not getting to emails and accounting problems and things, and that was part of the root of why people were calling a lot. So what she did, and it was a painful decision, but she took the time and actually pulled people off of the phones, which sounds contrary, pulled them off of the phones to fix those back office problems so that people didn't have to just keep calling over and over again. And we're really starting to see the fruits of that come forward.
And if I may add to that as well, and from the public works side, and to your question, we made some adjustment as well. We fixed the website to a certain extent where residents can actually request services through a form rather than calling, so they had the opportunity to do something after 5. And believe it or not, a lot of our emails we received were between 12 and 3 o'clock in the morning. So because of those adjustments, our call volume did go down. And which
Didn't realize Phoenix was the city that doesn't sleep, right?
yeah, it is interesting, but it did, and just making that small adjustment reduced our call volume, and it provided a better customer service for our customers moving forward. So they can get the services they wanted when they wanted them, not just 8 to 5.
And I'm sorry, Councilwoman Williams, if I could break in too, there's one last point I want to make regarding the management oversight report, which is important. One of the other things that they found as a risk is that we ourselves are a little bit behind in some of our tasks that are due as part of this project. And specifically, that's the development of some of our business processes and associated policies and procedures that go along with those. That's actually strategic and on purpose. I want to give you that perspective. Because we decided that instead of customizing the software to meet how we do business today, we were going to do the opposite and change our business practices to meet the software. We have intentionally held off on creating some of these processes and policies to see what the software actually offered and to make sure that we could implement it in that form. But that being said, we're a little bit behind in terms of creating some of these policies. And that's important to Bill Green's office, the auditor's office, because he needs to come back at some point and make sure that we have the correct controls in place. But that is something, again, that decision was made on purpose, and we have every intention of catching up with that schedule and making sure that the correct controls are in place.
Thank you.
So in addition to staffing that you'll see on the agenda, we talked a little bit about the training module, which is going to be automating our training for our customer service and solid waste staff. This is an enhancement to the current contractor, which requires a change order. Its cost is $200,000, and it's 100% funded by the enterprise funds. We will be coming back to council on May 18th and asking for approval to move forward with this change order. So our next steps, we're going to continue testing through the spring. We'll be bringing forward both the staffing that Debbie talked to you about as well as the training module to council May 18th. And we'll be finalizing bill print outsourcing. Hopefully by August 2016, you'll be seeing that in council as well. that's all we have. Do you have any other questions?
I have a question, if you would go back to that other slide. When you say finalized bill print outsourcing, how is the bill printed now?
Councilwoman Williams, Councilwoman Pastor, so today, the CCNB software produces a data file that then communicates with 2 additional software packages. One of them is called Doc One. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the other. There's another. It's very complicated. And then that software, as I understand it, takes the data download and converts it into something that can then be printed by the city clerk's office. I'm sorry, did you have? Okay, so in about, gosh, I guess it's been about 5 years now. The city actually looked to outsourcing about 5 years ago. And one of the reasons that we found we couldn't outsource the bill print side of things was because we had done all these customizations that we were not able to give over a clean data file to the companies that produce the bill. And so that's why moving forward, we really want to clean up that software and provide a clean data file to a bill print outsource. I've met with the city clerk's office. Again, this is something that we tried to do 5 years ago, and for various reasons, mostly the customizations couldn't get there. We want to try again. Currently, the city clerk's office does not dedicate one full-time position to this because it's so automated. So we don't anticipate that there will be any impact to existing staff. It really just becomes an issue of reliability of the machinery and software that's in place. And that really has been problematic over the last few years. There have been several times when we've had to delay the printing and mailing of bills because of it. So that's one of many reasons why we just think it's best practice to move to outsourcing that bill print.
And what would be the cost savings by outsourcing?
So, Councilwoman Williams, Councilwoman Pastor, I have not calculated those numbers. I'm happy to bring those back to you. Really, the justification for doing this really had to do with reliability and making sure that we could get these bills out the door. But I'm happy to, an industry best practice, as Debbie reminds me.
No, I understand that, but we'll have an offside conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. We're happy to bring
Thank
those
you.
numbers back.
Any further questions? Okay. Vice Mayor?
So you know my favorite billing question is Spanish language bills.
Yeah.
Should you give us an update?
I'm sorry, I don't have one. I'm looking to Alicia.
I apologize. I'll be happy to meet with you and give you an update on that. I don't have anything right now.
Any other comments or questions? Well, thank you very much for coming in, and we'll look forward to having you come back this fall and tell us how wonderful everything's going.
Let's hope so. Yes, thank you.
We'll go to item 9, groundwater management. I think, Vice Mayor, this is an item that you had requested more information on.
Oh, am I going first? Okay, great. Well, Councilwoman Williams, Subcommittee, thank you for having me again here to talk about groundwater management. The Vice Mayor had requested that this information come forward, as had several of you offline. You had requested to know a little bit more about how we manage our groundwater supplies today. So with me today is Brandy Kelso. She's going to take us through some basics about our groundwater, our wells, our recharge facilities, and what we're doing with all of that.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a basic objective with groundwater. We try to use a little as much as possible now so that we can save it for either emergency conditions or drought conditions. In addition, we're in a mode of trying to take as much water, surface water that we have, and put it into the ground to even build the amount of groundwater we have for the future. And we do this really in kind of 2 strategic ways. One is through aquifer storage and recovery wells, or ASR wells, and recharge basins. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of where we're at with those, and also tell you a little bit about how much groundwater we currently have available for our use today. So I wanted to show you kind of what is ASR, because I think a visual always helps. So on the, I guess that's your left, my left also. First we take surface water and we inject it into the ground. And so that's basically the purpose of putting more water into the ground. It goes into the aquifer and actually kind of mounds up around the well. And then later on, when we actually need that water, we can take into recovery mode and pull the water back out. The good thing with that is through the state, we have to get what is called a cut to the aquifer. It's 5%. So if we put in 100 acre feet, we can withdraw 95, but 5 acre feet stays back into the ground. So it's a way for us to help build the groundwater and keep it sustainable, as well as have it there for our future use. Currently, we have 3 ASR wells in operation. They can put in about 5,000 acre feet. They can take out a little bit more, but like I said, there's that cut to the aquifer. We do have other water that they can pull out. It's just not necessarily the recharged water. We have an additional 4 ASR wells in our CIP now, and so you can see that will more than double what we have the ability to both put into the ground as well as take out.
And Councilwoman Williams, I'd like to mention here, because Brandy's being shy, but she has fantastic staff who really look very carefully at exactly where these wells should be located, both in terms of system reliability and in terms of benefit to the aquifer. They do some pretty amazing research in that regard.
How do they measure how much is there? I mean, do you monitor on a regular basis to make sure something hasn't happened one way or the other, or if by natural causes it would continue to rise?
So, Councilwoman Williams, as you can imagine, to some degree, what happens in the aquifer is a bit of a mystery, right? It's very difficult to measure, but we do measure frequently. The main measure that's used is the depth to groundwater, but there are also some other measures, such as the transmissivity of a well, which is basically how quickly the well can pull the water out of the porous spaces within the aquifer. So that we have a few clues, is what I would say. And we monitor those clues very, very closely.
We also have an extensive groundwater model that we take information from ADWR and other municipal partners, and we put all that in the model, and from that we can simulate kind of what's happening as well. In addition to ASR wells, we also use recharge basins. The most common one for us to use is GRUSP. The Granite Reef Underground Storage Facility that we have partnered with several other cities and SRP. And in this case, it's a little bit different than a well. We're not pushing the water in through the well and directly into the aquifer, but instead you're doing it on the surface, and then it seeps through and gets to the aquifer that way. This is similar to what we're doing with our Tucson exchange agreement as well. So overall, we currently have about 3.7 million acre feet of allowance credits. So we get that from various things. Our 100-year assured water supply gives us some of those. Every year, based on how much water we use, there's a certain amount that does go back to the aquifer, so we get credits for that, as well as the things ASR and GRUSP that we're actually putting actual water into the ground, we get those credits as well. So that number continues to grow. And then we did just note on here, last year we put a little over 1,000 acre feet in with our Tucson partners, and we've increased that again this year and plan to continue doubling that.
And Councilwoman Williams, I wanted to mention here, because I think it's really important, to give you some perspective on this, 3.7 million acre feet of groundwater credits, more than 200,000 acre feet of long-term storage credits. This is a very large amount of water that is available to us, both legally and physically. The City of Phoenix, back in the mid-'80s, made a very conscious choice to move away from pumping groundwater supplies and using renewable surface water supplies so that we could save this groundwater for the future. So we're really proud that for the most part, we have not had to dip into these supplies. In fact, we've been building these supplies. That's really important for our future moving forward as we look to a climate that is very extreme, much more variable than it was in the past. That's really important to us, and we really want to be sure to protect those resources for future generations.
So currently our overall well system is 23 active wells. They can produce about 45,000 acre feet a year. We have a project right underway right now where we're trying to permit an additional 20 wells a year. So those won't be able to pull water right out of the ground immediately, but we'll have them in places that are strategic where we know we're going to need water, and that we'll be able to drill those wells when the time comes to drill them.
When we want to be sure to have a very balanced ability to withdraw groundwater and to be able to rely on not only our wells, but also Tucson's wells during shortage on the Colorado River. The City of Phoenix has largely been successful in developing sustainable water supplies because it developed them from various different sources. We never had all of our eggs in one basket. We want the same to be true for our ability to pull groundwater supplies back out from under the ground. So that was the main impetus for the exchange with the City of Tucson, is to be able to leverage their wells. But we also want to drill some of our own, so that, again, we just don't have all of our eggs in one basket, and we have the ability to pull water out of the ground during very extreme scenarios.
And you can see from.
Just
Oh,
to,
go
sorry,
ahead.
just a question on that. So we have 23 now, so you're talking about permitting 60. Why so aggressive?
Councilwoman Williams, Councilmember Gates, what I would say is that you can never go wrong permitting a well. And it takes years to develop the permit and to do the hydrogeology, to then drill and equip the well. So we want to get ahead of the game and have those future opportunities available to us. We're still in the process of determining exactly how many wells we think we want to have versus how dependent on Tucson's wells we want to be, versus how much surface water we can move around the system during extreme events. So all of this analysis is still going on, but in the meantime, moving forward with permitting wells is never going to be a bad decision.
In addition, we have about 40 inactive wells for a variety of reasons. Either the sites are too small, or they've got some sort of groundwater issue like nitrates or things like that. And so doing the 60 only kind of replaces 40 and is only about 20 extra, to put that in perspective as well.
And Madam Chair, how long does it take, once you've permitted a well, how long does it take to drill it and actually put it into operation?
Couple years.
3 to 4 years.
So yeah, Councilwoman Williams, Councilmember Gates, we want to get ahead of the game on this.
Thank you.
You'll see on the map that we provided, I think you have a larger sheet there. You can see a lot of our current wells, and what we've been focusing on is kind of more the northern part of our surface area. We just wanted to note that the southern part is within SRP's area, and so in that regard, we're looking to more partner with them as opposed to having wells that compete with where they have wells. So didn't want you to be, concern that looks like we have more wells to the north. It's purposeful just because of our partnership with SRP.
Could you tell us a little bit about CAP's well program?
Councilwoman Williams, Councilwoman Gallego, or I'm sorry, Vice Mayor Gallego, the CAP currently does not have a well program. And in fact, the CAP does not currently have the legal ability to move groundwater in the canal system. It's considered to be non-project water, and there's no framework to move non-project water in the canal right now. That's why you can see on the map, we're very focused on building our wells in the portions of the City of Phoenix that are served with Colorado River water, because that really is where our vulnerabilities lie. Within the Salt River Valley Water Users Association territory, we're relatively secure, not only in terms of our water rights, but also physically in terms of our ability to move water around. So for example, we have supplies up behind Roosevelt Dam and up on the Verde that are our own supplies that aren't owned by SRP, they're owned by us. So during shortage conditions, it's very easy for us to move that water down the canal system and move it throughout the portions of the City of Phoenix served with SRP water. That's not true when you look outside of those boundaries, when you look at the parts of Phoenix that are served with Colorado River water. That's where we do have some vulnerabilities, and that's where it is more difficult for us to push water, for example, as far north as it might need to go during a shortage situation. So that's why we're really focused on wells in those particular areas.
It looks like our active wells are disproportionately in District 2. Is that because of the geology? Can you talk about why?
Sure, Vice Mayor Gallego. Some of that has to do with the inactive wells are in areas where we're finding either the wells are kind of shallow, and so they can have issues with nitrates from past farming and things like that. And so in those areas, especially like if you look at the western area of the service area, we'll look to possibly go deeper, or can we blend wells with potable water to get to the water quality that we're looking for. We've focused a lot over the last 4 or 5 years kind of in the Northwest, just because for a long time all we had was Union Hills, and then with Lake Pleasant coming on, the surface water supplies weren't as robust there, so we had focused a lot in that area. We also saw declining groundwater levels in that area, and so the ASR well program was really put in to kind of bolster the levels there and stabilize them. So it's one of those things that you kind of look at an area and you work on it and then you move to the next area. But most of it is more water quality driven.
Great, thank you.
And I think that's all we have.
And we have a limited number of aquifers in this state, especially under the city of Phoenix. And I don't believe, have sole authority for usage, do we? How do you monitor and know who else is pulling water out of the aquifers, and we're still maintaining our balances?
So Councilwoman Williams, that's an excellent question. So broadly, what I would say is that the Arizona Department of Water Resources maintains the regional groundwater model that allows us to determine who is pulling water out of the aquifer, what the impact on water levels is over time. But it is, from a legal perspective, the entire Valley of the Sun is treated as a bathtub. And the goal, as you know, of the Phoenix Active Management Area is safe yield, which means that we need to get to a place where the amount of water that we're taking out of the aquifer equals the amount of water that we're putting back into the aquifer by the year 2025. But what the laws in the current framework really don't recognize is that it matters if you pump water from one end of the aquifer but recharge it all the way on the other end of the aquifer. And so we do see regional cones of depression and regional problems that do concern us. And that's why one of the policies that we brought forward to the Phoenix City Council last year was this idea of improving aquifer management and making sure that we're doing better for the long term. Phoenix is relatively fortunate in that except for in the northern portion of our service territory, we're kind of in the middle of the aquifer. So adverse impacts we would expect to see will happen on the fringe of the aquifer first. But we want to take a very, very long-term view of this. We want to look out 100 years and make sure that this water is still available for us and regionally in the Valley of the Sun.
Thank you. Any comments, questions? Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Next item is call to the public. Howard? Did I answer your question?
You did. Thank
Okay.
you.
Hello again. A few minutes ago, you were talking about billing for water services. I know a friend of mine that the last time you changed it, he wasn't too happy because he's not up to date with technology as a few of you are. And so something that water services needs to look at is how many people that are low vision or seniors that have either limited internet or have no internet and how it affects them. I know he called water services on found out they can still give him a paper bill. So that was that thing there. As you guys progress with Transit 250, I know you guys are going to upgrade or redo some of the streets as you go along and phase them in. Recently, I was at 24th Street in Indian School, and I was having issues because rocks on the sidewalk and that corner needing an upgrade. And there's several places across the city. As I see something, I tell you guys, either by a phone call or by email. There are some spots in the city where they need to be looked at again. As I find something, I let you guys know because I don't like rocks. And In fact, I'm going to be letting streets know about something I found earlier, and that was a non-working push button. So there are spots in the city where I feel that it could be better to make my life easier to where I'm not stumbling into the rocks or walking into parking lots. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we appreciate you sending the information forward to us. Future agenda items. Does anyone have any special requests? Hearing none, we are adjourned.
I think